Yeah, so the end of May was the 50th anniversary of the recording of Louis Armstrong and his friends. It was his penultimate album. Oliver Nelson did the arrangements. Bob Thiel was the producer. Things like Give Peace a Chance, We Shall Overcome, remake of What a Wonderful World. Got big bands with Thad Jones and Pretty Purdy and all this stuff. It still
Mhm.
remains, I think, one of Armstrong's lesser known recordings. There's no trumpet playing. And again, there's that early 70s flair to it that I think a lot of the uh, diehard traditional jazz folks didn't really respond to. But
Man, but it's great. It's
isn't it? Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about it because I know you are our gift shop guru, and that record played in our gift shop every day for about the last 2 years we were open. So right now we're doing all these posts, taking people into the sessions, showing Jack Bradley photos, showing the
uh
arrangements, showing how Lewis prepared for it. I mean, he had all that music: Harry Nilsson,
right.
the Beatles, Leon Thomas. What are your thoughts about that record?
I love that record. You know, it's funny because sometimes you listen to records like Blue Note records, like in the late '60s, and you'll hear like a lot of like Sidewinder kind of like boogaloo kind of songs, and people today, particularly younger musicians, they don't get it. And I think one of the things you have to put in the context is that the scene was changing quickly. Like the clubs were closing, uh, Train had died, Bird and Billie Holiday had long been gone. Like it was changing kind of rapidly. And after like the British invasion, you know, a lot of the younger musicians, Motown was like ascendant. Like a lot of the younger musicians felt like they were being a little bit left behind. And so you could hear in a lot of these records of musicians looking for different ways of reaching out to younger musicians, younger audiences, looking for different venues to play in and things like that. And a lot of those records to me get like a bad rap, you know, particularly like the organ dates or the soul jazz dates, you know, Sonny Stitz on all these organ dates with like Don Patterson that are incredible and nobody talks about that stuff. And I think Lewis was kind of in the same bag of like reaching out to newer audiences. And he did it in such a way that wasn't weird. You know, like the country album is kind of weird, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's just like, whoa, what's that? But this one, like he really got it, you know, and I think a lot of it had to do with Oliver Nelson, who was another unsung hero. Uh, he was one of the few black arrangers who was able to move to California and start working in studios, working in radio, working in like television shows and doing soundtracks for movies and things like that. Uh, you know, it wasn't many of those guys, you know, maybe Benny Carter early on and Quincy Jones and Benny Golson. So it wasn't a lot of those guys around. And he really struck the right balance with this Lewis date. Uh, it was, you know, Bernard Purdy's on it. So anything with Bernard Purdy, you just have to listen to. I don't care. And if you don't like Bernard Purdy, there's something wrong with you, you know. And you know, the breadth of tunes, the way it's spread out over the course of that record, it really tells a story. It's you know, like it ends with this black cat has 9 lives. You know, like that's Lewis's last commercial song, if you think about it. Uh, it's 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 poignant. And then all of the people who came for that record date. So there's a famous picture with Miles Davis. You can sense that the jazz community was realizing how important this guy was, and are we losing him, or we want to be a part of this. So Miles Davis is on that date. Ornette Coleman, and Miles Davis in the same room. Tony Bennett, Leon Thomas. It's an amazing date. And it doesn't come across as kind of kitschy. Like he really hit on all 9 cylinders. Just everything was kind of smooth sailing on that date. You can hear it. And was Lewis's tracks, were they overdubbed? Do you
Oh,
know?
all live. Jack Bradley was there and took all the photos, and the string section, everything was in the huge RCA studios in Manhattan, and so all done live.
Man, I know that building well. 44th Street.
That's it. That's
Yeah,
it.
I know that building well. I've been in that room, man. It was huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Jack got all the photos, the choir. Like when they did We Shall Overcome and Give Peace a Chance, they invited everybody in the room to come stand and sing along.
Right.
So, yeah, you picture Ornette and Tony Bennett and everybody, shouting those lyrics with Lewis. I mean, I don't know, it's
Right.
mind-boggling.
There's the famous picture of Miles, like he's in his Bitches Brew leather jumpsuit, and like the roles are flipped. Like Miles is a huge smile on his face, and Lewis looks like very stern. Like you can see like the roles had flipped. And yeah, there's also stuff, like another thing about that date is like he does. Creator Has a Master Plan.
Right.
That became kind of a minor hit, and we saw Pharoah Sanders last summer, right? Didn't we?
Yeah.
Like he's got to play that tune for the rest of his life, man. Like are people going to ask for their money back? So he did Creator Has a Master Plan with Leon Thomas. Leon is on the original too.
Yes, yeah, and Lewis had to listen to that. We have the prep reel. Before he went into the studio, Bob Thiel visited Lewis at home in Queens and brought him Plastic Ono Band. He brought him Leon Thomas records. He brought him Harry Nilsson records. He brought him some demo records. Some of those songs were new.
Right.
And so Lewis, he trained for that record like a boxer. He listened to that stuff on tape. He dubbed songs over and over again,
Right.
and had the sheet music. So when he showed up, he was ready.
What now was there supposed to be another date? Because when I met Ron Carter, he said that he was on a record date with Oliver Nelson, and Lewis came by just to say hello, and they kind of mentioned that they were going to be on the date together, and it never happened. Do you know about that?
Ron posted a photo on Facebook and Instagram in May of him and Lewis at one of those sessions. I had never seen it before. I almost fell out of my chair. It's unbelievable.
Okay.
So
yeah,
and Lewis looks, has to be around 1970 or so. Yeah,
right.
I'm assuming
when Ron told me about it, he just went, "Little guy." He said, "Lewis, little guy." Right.
Yeah, the heartbreaking thing for me is Nelson prepared arrangements of Errol Garner's "Dreamy," which George Weiss wrote new lyrics, and "Let It Be" from the Beatles. And
that's it.
And according to Bob Thiel, the producer, by the end of the third session, they were wiped out. They ran overtime. They had 10 songs, and they decided that was enough. So we actually have the full unrecorded arrangements. If there's any musicians out there that want to get together a band and get a vocal,
right,
hear what Oliver Nelson's arrangements of "Dreamy" and "Let It Be" sound like, we can make that happen.
Right. Because like in the documentary, Lewis sings "Let It Be" in the den.
Exactly. Yep.
And I'm like, he's getting ready for a record date. There's just, you know what I mean?
We have the sheet music for it. I mean, he was ready. He had the sheet music. He had the recording. He had the flip side. He was the single of "Let It Be." I mean, he was ready. Yeah, the commercial sheet music with the picture of the Beatles on the cover, the whole thing. So that's one of the big regrets.
Right. And you think about like "Let It Be" and then "Give Peace a Chance." Like these were kind of like "Give Peace a Chance" was kind of like an anti-war anthem, so to speak, and "Let It Be" was kind of like an ending for the Beatles. Right. So for Lewis to grab onto both of those it kind of puts things in a different kind of perspective,
Well, I think it's interesting that we're talking about this and celebrating it, because I mean, to me, it might be Armstrong's most relevant album. I mean, right now, you and I are speaking over Zoom. The world is in protest. It's in chaos right now. And
Yep.
that's why Lewis recorded this record in 1970. He met with Bob Thiel. They went over the songs.
Yep.
Thiel talked about, he mentioned "We Shall Overcome." Lewis jumped
Hmm.
up, grabbed the tape of Martin Luther King's funeral, and they played that version of "We Shall Overcome." They talked
Yep.
about "Give Peace a Chance." There's the "What a Wonderful World" where Lewis gives the speech in the beginning, and it's amazing.
It's different. That's different than the other. That's different than the first version.
Very different. The
Yeah.
arrangement different. Everything's
Yeah.
different. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
um, what was going on in the world back then, and how Lewis, Bob Thiel knew that Lewis could be a healing voice, and it's just
Yeah.
been wild. We've been sharing songs on social media, and we've been putting these posts up, and here you and I are talking about it now, and it still feels completely relevant. You could record those same songs today with the same message, I think.
It's kind of weird because like I wasn't around, but like when you look back at like the late '60s, like there's Vietnam War, and there was civil unrest, there was rioting. Malcolm X had been shot, Martin Luther King had been shot. Things were kind of like raging, and those songs were they seemed like they were picked specifically for to convey an overall message. Because there's we shall overcome. So that tells you what's Lewis used to give money to Martin Luther King.
Sure.
He used to donate, and didn't he protest the Grammys? He protested the Grammys.
The Oscars, yeah, he wouldn't go to the Oscars after King was
Right.
assassinated. Yeah.
Right. There's that, and then when you look at today, like during the Spanish flu pandemic, 1918, 1919, that was also the Red Summer. That was also a summer of like incredible lynching and race riots that ran across the country. And society was kind of frayed. Like in 1919, it was frayed in the late '60s, and today we're like on our last leg. Like 40 million people without a job, and 100,000 people dead, and then Central Park isn't cool, and I could have told you that, but like one after another. And so when we're talking about Give Peace a Chance, or when we talk like these weren't kind of like random, or they weren't meant to be panaceas, like we're just gonna all hold hands and kumbaya. But it was kind of pointing to like that at some point humanity is going to have to move together in such a way that it's going to be bigger than these problems. And I think that was kind of an overarching theme with Lewis, even when you read like My Life in New Orleans as a child. The cops beating up the kid. The cops used to, the billy clubs. He would talk about the billy clubs from the cops and all these things. And so he never denied these things. He just knew that his music was a weapon against it. And you can see that consistently. You see that in the '40s. You see that in the '50s. You see that in the '60s. You see it. Like it's quite evident.
Yeah, even today, when we post something on social media about Lewis and Little Rock, or Lewis's statements on Selma or whatever, people are still surprised. Oh my goodness, I had no idea. And so, we've been trying to educate the world for 10 years, but why don't you talk for a few minutes about, Lewis speaking out on injustice, his reputation during his lifetime, his reputation today as a civil rights pioneer. I know it's a very complex subject, but what are your initial thoughts?
It's pretty heavy. I think, first of all, he never denied who he was in any shape or form. And I think if you just start from like the earliest part of his career, like when he went to Chicago, so that really represents a migration. He's part of the Great Migrations. And anybody who, during this period of 50 some odd years or so, like anybody who's part of that, their experience is very much like the immigrant experience. They were still within the same country, but like the culture was different, the climates were different, and when you take these people who are from the South and they move to these Detroit or Chicago or New York, it's an extreme culture shock. And so, those stories aren't that much different than people who come here from South America or Europe, or, they're leaving oppression, they're looking for like a better life. And I think that one of the first things that Lewis kind of encountered, like in the North, particularly like when he joined Fletcher Henderson's band, like him and Coleman Hawkins, they didn't like it. They didn't like each other. And it was kind of that rural versus urban kind of a thing. Like it was kind of like Coleman Hawkins considered him almost like a hick, And so whatever, like Lewis's influence kind of changed the Coleman Hawkins band almost overnight. So much for that. But I think this is something that he always carried with him. And throughout his entire career, there was Sleepy Time Down South and things like that. So when you take these templates that were kind of imprinted on him at an early age, before he left New Orleans, and how he navigated throughout incredible racism in Hollywood, incredible racism on the road. These things kind of played out, it didn't really change much, like over the course of his career. He was pretty consistent on how he dealt with these things. Now, so, I think today, like people who were born in the 70s and beyond, when they see images of Lewis, like they don't understand it. And so, there has to be some kind of explanation of what entertainment was like in the 1930s. So I told somebody, just a couple of months ago, I'm like, you do understand, like Billie Holiday performed in blackface when she toured with Count Basie's band in the South. That was expected. People don't really understand that. And was it demeaning? Absolutely. But the sheer power of their artistry and understanding of this is what we have to do to operate and to survive was astounding. And then also the concept of celebrity today, particularly in the African American community, is a lot different than it was back then. So, today, a celebrity is expected to have a political stance, particularly a Black celebrity, and then Black performers, they're very conscious of like how they're being perceived on stage. That has nothing to do with just their performance. In Lewis's earlier career, they didn't have a lot of these luxuries. Somebody like Paul Robeson, who was very political, ruined his career by being incredibly steadfast about the things that he believed in. He was kind of among the first. But then later on, it happened to Eartha Kitt and Lena Horne and things like that. And a lot of musicians who were from an earlier generation, Lewis, Duke Ellington, like these guys were very apolitical. If you looked below the surface, you could see what they had to offer. But very rarely did they step outside of their role as a performer. And Duke Ellington would do Black, Brown, and Beige, and he would do all these great pieces of work, but you would never see him with a picket. No way. They felt that their artistry was their way of combating these things. And your post, there's not much you can add to like the post that you did the other day, but it really shows how complicated and how layered it was to navigate this career from 1922 till he died. Is amazing. I was telling one of our fellows, because she's doing a paper on Lewis and film about some of his early roles, and I'm like, you do realize that he did not play those roles at the end of his life,
Right.
like, and those roles were still available in the late '60s. He didn't do them, so his whole career in film showed a different kind of growth and a different kind of access to different roles, and he never went backwards. You have to look at the arc of that type of a thing. If he stayed the same way, it would still be, but he didn't do that,
Yeah, your Paris Blues, Man Called Adam by the 60s, it's no more singing Jeepers Creepers to a horse at that point.
No. I mean, for me, Man Called Adam is like the big one, because Cecily Tyson, Lola Falana, Frank Sinatra Jr., but he's no Frank, let's be honest.
Right.
And Sammy Davis is basically playing Miles Davis.
Right.
Cecily Tyson ends up marrying Miles Davis 20 years later. It was like life imitating art.
Right.
And and Sammy was one of the people who spoke out against Lewis when Lewis started to go outside of his role of being just a performer.
Right.
He went in print about this, how Lewis doesn't really represent the Black voice and this, that, and the other. And towards the end of his life, he's in a movie with Lewis. He's a pallbearer at Lewis's funeral. And then, lo and behold, the same thing happens to Sammy, like in his later years. Right. So now he's starting to lose Black audiences. And he sided with Richard Nixon. That was very, very controversial at the time. And he never went back on his choices and decisions. But you can see that as a young man, him critiquing Lewis, those same critiques came back and towards him as well. It's very complicated.
Yeah.
Very complicated. Another thing too, I always talk about is like the Ebony magazine, mm-hmm. where he because Ebony is colorism ground zero, for a long time. And the Johnsons, they would have different publications, Tan. Some of them, you had Ebony, and then you had Tan.
Right.
And Jet. These are all the same. These are all the same publications. So in Jet, they have 1952 of Negro singers who refused to pass. Right?
Yep.
Is that 1952, 53?
52, yeah.
52. But then Lewis in 1958, is it? He does Why I Always Like Dark-Skinned Women.
Right. Yeah, 54, but yeah.
54. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Why I Always Like 1954. That is 20 years before the Black is Beautiful movement. Yeah. And he did it on Ebony magazine, which was like an affront to like everything that magazine is about. And now in 1966, I have a picture. I'll send it to you. There's a Ebony magazine. The cover, it says, "Are Negro women getting prettier?" And none of them look like Lucille.
Right.
None of them look like Lucille. So for Lewis to do that at that time tells you that his consciousness was way above, and he saw all of these things happening, and he knew when and where to express himself in this context. And then the thing that got me about your post, because I'd heard all this stuff, blah, 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 years of being there and talking to you and whatever, was in 1970 when they're saying the only people now calling was the NAACP. They were saying the only people who are really calling Lewis a Tom now are white writers.
Right. Right.
And that tells you something. It was the same. I think it was the same thing. I think towards the end of his life, people started to realize they were losing him. They were losing this powerful person. And so now these roles had switched. There was like a 1970 version of like virtual signaling, that was happening. So I think towards the end of Lewis's life, he was a little bitter because he had lost his black audiences for a little while, for a long time, but it was slowly creeping up.
Yeah.
The Flip Wilson, I've seen that clip a million times with him on Flip Wilson. That was the baddest show of all time too, by the way. And
I've always felt if Lewis died in Beth Israel Hospital, like after writing the Karnofsky family manuscript, which is so bitter and so filled with pain and depression,
right,
it would have been a sad ending, because he would have died
right.
feeling that way. And, you couldn't really blame him for feeling that way because, he had, as he always said, he was out there, doing things in his own fashion, completely unapologetically black the whole time. And here he is in
right.
68, his black audience has dwindled down. And then he goes in the hospital. He lets all this pain out in this document, which some people have interpreted without the context. And I think that's a danger to do. But he gets out of the hospital. And to me, it's those last 2 years where he records the Oliver Nelson album, where he is on Flip Wilson, where he's taking pictures with Miles. And there's the downbeat tribute, the Roses for Satchmo, where there's quotes from Archie Shepp and,
that's great.
Sun Ra and everything. And I think he really gets this last little victory lap where, he made his peace with black musicians, with the jazz world. And I think they understood him. They realized how important he was. You look at any photos of the funeral, any photos of Corona when he died, I mean, it's 98%.
The Armory footage, that's the one that always got me.
Right.
Because that was in Manhattan. That was
Park Avenue.
And it was like, it was incredible.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
And so the people who are really writing the worst, you could say, obituaries, they're all the white writers. Greg, I forget his name, some from the New York Times. I can name them all, but they're the ones who really had the biggest problem, that he didn't live up to his 1928 potential. And I think the black writers and the black press and musicians, they knew what he navigated. They knew what he spoke out when he had to. They knew he broke down the barriers. And
also, I think a lot of his earlier critics were now older.
Right.
So, it's, like the beboppers, they didn't go that route. And so, they're like, well, we're not going to tour the South. We're not going to do it. The traveling had changed, the World War II tariffs. They weren't going to deal with Jim Crow. They were a younger generation. They were right. They were like, man, this is crazy. But then Lewis was like, man, I've been doing this for 20 years. What is a 20-year-old kid going to tell a 40-year-old professional, like a successful professional? It's crazy. But, before you know it, man, like Benny Goodman makes a bebop record because he thinks it's going to make money, And, when it didn't make any money, he pulled the plug, man. Mary Lou, all of them, they were out, once the bebop, man, those guys were hustling, man. Dizzy's doing R&B records and hard bop kind of like helped out a little bit. And I think these guys, they by the time that Lewis had died, they were in their 30s. Like they understood something. 40s, really.
40s, yeah. Yeah.
Now they had like an understanding of like, and how do you maintain a career for that long and be that successful and be that creative? You could see it, like things had changed. And so, when you're young, you say a lot of things that, you're very passionate about, but you don't know much about it. Everybody's done it, that's why nobody listens to people when they're 20 years old. They're like, but then once they start to process this information, then they're just like the gleam. Like, what's the story Winton tells about Train and Lewis?
Oh, that Lewis came in, I think in Chicago to see the quartet. and the whole energy of the room changed. And
Right.
Lewis, there was no fanfare, no introduction. He just walked in and sat down, and everybody knew he was there. There was an electricity in the room. I think Train told Elvin Jones, he said, we were wrong about that guy here, because that man's a god. There was something different. This wasn't
Right.
just a trumpet player walking in the room. This was like
Right.
something from another planet.
You ever heard that record? That there's a Earl Hines record with Elvin.
Oh yeah, that's
Big
a
band
great
record, man.
Yeah,
It's killing.
half the Ellington band in there. Yeah, that's great. That's great.
It's killing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so that's Train. Like at the height of like, that's it, And so I think the appreciation changed, and I think the appreciation changed because the understanding was catching up. And Lewis, I think, really set a precedent for how is a performer, particularly a Black performer, how do they maintain a long career? Like, how do you age gracefully,
right,
while being a performer? Like, how do you do that? How do you maintain a house and a wife and touring? And how do you learn how to not do the kind of gigs that you had to do when you were 20 years old and things like that? And I think there's a lesson in it just for that, just for that. And it's incredible to be a cutting edge and pushing the envelope musician, but at some point it's got to be shared with people. People have to understand this, and you have to meet them. There's got to be a middle ground, and I think Lewis showed you how to do that. So, in the context of, Lewis and Friends, that's a great example. Like, he made quote unquote a commercial record, but he didn't sell out whatsoever. He didn't sell out. He got his message out from the first note to the last note.